Okay, well, thank you all so much for coming. We're really excited to have you here. I was personally very excited to get an email from Genevieve's publisher asking would we host an event for Beyond Blue and White, because a friend of mine, who's a mutual friend of ours, said, oh, you must host an event for Beyond Blue and White. That was easy. And they're often not easy to organize, but it's just been such a pleasure working with Genevieve. So I'll introduce Genevieve and then we'll get started. Then afterwards, we'll take some questions and have a brief discussion. And then, of course, there's coffee and snacks for everyone afterwards. If you ordered a book in advance, we have it back for you there and she'll sign it for you. And if you didn't and have changed your mind and would like to order a book, you can. We have extras. So thank you again for coming and let's get started. As a decorative art advisor and writer with over 30 years in the art world, including a decade with Christie's in New York and London, Genevieve Wheeler Brown has been actively involved in the community of Delftware. She has also participated on the Antiques Roadshow as an appraiser, with an eye out for the overlooked treasure. In her role, she has held innumerable objects, objects, not objets, sorry, from fake Stradivari violins to gold-mounted Fabergé eggs, considering their value, but also the stories they can tell. Beyond Blue and White has been named an NPR Here and Now editor's pick, the art newspaper's book bag selection, and recently received a glowing review in print by the Wall Street Journal. Yay! Thanks, Genevieve. You're welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. This is such a pleasure to be here with the Holland Society, the Friends of the Holland Society, in what might be the most perfect setting, surrounded by blue and white. Writing Beyond Blue and White took me on an expansive journey over 5 years through America, through England, through the Netherlands, of course. But the spark that actually began was right here in Manhattan, just a few blocks away from where we are today. And it began with something actually quite small. It was a blue and white jug tucked away on a glass shelf in a quiet corner. Now that little jug unlocked a much greater, bigger story of hidden women, of hidden histories of women whose influence has long been overlooked. So this afternoon, let's follow that trail together and see where the blue and white and the women behind it can lead us. So I've spent more than 30 years as a writer and an art advisor in the decorative arts, but my story actually begins earlier when I was growing up in Washington, D.C. And while most people think of Washington as a place of politics, it was for me also a place of art. And my favorite childhood escape, well, right there, the Freer Gallery. And against where I fell in love with Whistler's Peacock Room. So it's gold against deep blue and green, the shelves lined with ceramics. That early fascination with objects led me into a life in the decorative arts. Which mostly at Christie's in London and New York, handling everything from, as Sarah mentioned, Stradivari violins to Fabergé eggs, and yes, there were a few fakes along the way. So now let's fast forward to the summer of 2019. And out of the blue, I got a call from the chair of the Arts and Collections Committee of a women's organization that was founded during the Gilded Age. It's called the National Society of Colonial Dames in the state of New York. Now, they wanted me to take a look at a small part of their expansive collection in their headquarters, a private townhouse in New York's Upper East Side. Now, I'll admit, I thought I was being invited to see a handful of objects. But when I walked in, what greeted me was astonishing. It was more than 75 pieces of 17th and 18th century Dutch Delftware. So now is the point where a few of you, or maybe most of you, might be asking, what exactly is Dutch Delftware? Now, if I say the term, maybe you picture the small square Dutch tiles. Here's a lovely one with a landscape. Or maybe you think of a plate covered with flowers and birds. Or maybe you think of one of those, the iconic towering vases. Sometimes we call them today the tulip vases. And basically, right, this is all true. But Delftware is also much, much more. There are three main kinds of ceramics in the world. There's porcelain, there's stoneware, and then there's earthenware. Earthenware is the oldest, and it was probably developed over 20,000 years ago. Buff or reddish clay, soft, and it's porous. Delftware is tin glazed earthenware, which is to say it's made by a technique that began in the Middle East in the 9th century as a way to imitate porcelain. That luminous, non-porous, naturally white ceramic perfected by the Chinese by the 8th century. So dip earthenware in white tin glaze, suddenly it's watertight and it looked refined. Now onto that bright surface, pieces of decoration, most often cobalt, which fired that brilliant blue that we all recognize. So that's Delftware. It's everyday clay that's been transformed into something truly extraordinary. Named, of course, after Delft, the city where it was made between approximately 1620 and the mid-19th century. But to understand why Delftware mattered, we need to set the scene. 17th century Holland, the Dutch Golden Age. Think Vermeer, Rembrandt, and Judith Leister, and Rachel Roish. I can't wait to go to the MFA to see the show. Maybe some people have already seen it. Tell me everything. I can't wait. The Dutch Republic, a small nation at the height of its powers, an economic powerhouse, rich in trade, bursting with art, and at the center of this wealth, the Dutch East India Company, founded 1602, which maintained a network that linked trading posts across Asia. And they brought back silks and spices and lacquer, even exotic animals. But the real prize, porcelain, Chinese porcelain called white gold. And for good reason, because Europe couldn't get enough. But then came a twist. Mid-1600s, war and turmoil in China during the transition between dynasties cut off the porcelain exports. Suddenly, porcelain dried up, declining from 250,000 pieces a year to really just a mere trickle. So cue a group of potters in the small town of Delft. We can do this, they said, and without access to that white Chinese clay, they rolled up their sleeves and they started using with a combination of local and imported materials, and with some clever tin glazed trickery, they started imitating the Chinese porcelain to fill that void. And sometimes at first glance, the resemblance is uncanny. And here's a fun challenge. One of these two here is Chinese porcelain, and the other is Delft. Both are from the 1600s. Both are in the Metropolitan Museum here in New York. And can you tell the difference? Not so easy, right? And if we held them in our hands, though, the differences would start to show. Well, Delft tends to feel just a little bit thicker. And when we flipped it over, on the back, you start to spot those spots where the buff-colored clay starts peeking through, especially in those spur marks, right? From firing or along that base edge. And if we ran our fingers across the surface of these, we'd start to notice those small, minute pinholes where the glaze would start to sink into that porous earthenware. Before long, Delftware was everywhere, from everyday dishes for the regular meals to luxurious garnitures that topped the costs. No Dutch home was complete without it, and it was marketed as Dutch porcelain, and it worked. At first, the Delft found its audience by imitating Asian porcelain, but it didn't take long before it had evolved into its own art form, of its own right, an international symbol of Dutch industry. Delft became its own global brand. So now back to 2019 and that Manhattan townhouse. So in this sea of dozens of pieces of Delftware, one piece stood out to me. Now, at first, it looked like a simple blue and white Delft picture, right? Then I noticed the rim, its sprouting spouts, its pierced neck practically dared me to try to think of drinking from it. This was no pitcher. This is a puzzle jug. Puzzle jugs were the life of a European 17th and 18th century party. They are part drinking vessel, they are part practical joke, and they are really part engineering marvel. They are logic puzzles disguised as pottery. The trick, hidden channels in the handle, secret holes. Cover the right ones in the right order, and you've got your wine. Miss one? Yeah, and you wore it. Can you imagine the laughter around the table in 18th century Holland? And let's be honest, a lot of Dutch linen napkins were probably sacrificed playing this game.
Right.
So I lifted that puzzle jug and I turned it over. And there it was. There were three initials, fused in cobalt, G, B, S. Now, after going to the reference books, I discovered something that I was not expecting. Her name is Gertrude Verstella, a woman, pottery owner, a story. Now, those three little letters stopped me in my tracks. They cracked open centuries of forgotten history. Who was she? And how many other women are hiding in Delftware's history? So the deeper I dug, the clearer it became. Women weren't footnotes in Delftware. They were everywhere. Research shows that 1 in 5 of all the names of the registered owners of Delftware potteries from the 17th through the early 19th century were female. 1 in 5. Some inherited their businesses as widows. Clearly, they were often the former business partners with their husbands. And others, like Barbara Rodeville, who founded her own pottery in 1671, were entrepreneurs from the start. But how did Dutch women in the 17th and 18th century be able to achieve this? Well, the success of women in the Delftware industry, as well as other businesses of the Dutch Republic, was really no accident at all. It rested on a rare mix of legal rights, education, and often necessity. Dutch women could inherit equally with their brothers. And in 1654, the Guild of St. Luke allowed widows to keep running their husbands' workshops for life without having to take that required master's test. And add to that widespread education. Dutch girls learned reading, writing, arithmetic, but also, ready for it, accounting. And they had financial literacy. And all of this strengthened their independence. Benjamin Franklin admired this Dutch system. And in 1786, he urged the American women to be trained in what he thought were the useful skills, bookkeeping, quote, instead of music and dancing, and to guard against what Franklin called, again, quote, the crafty men. Now, by 1650, 70% of Amsterdam's bridegrooms and half of the brides signed their names. This is well above the European average of the time of only 35 to 40%. Now, of course, not everybody loved this. Dutch women faced mixed messages, just like women today. Jacob Katz's 1625 bestseller, Huwelijk, Marriage, the most widely read book after the Bible in the Dutch Republic, warned against women running businesses, but reality said otherwise. Population records show us that Delft had more women than men, in part due to the fact that many of these men were abroad with the Dutch East India Company. Now, for investors, the Dutch East India Company was incredibly lucrative, but for the sailors and the accompanying soldiers, it was deadly. Voyages were so dangerous that they earned the grim nickname, the Indianschlacht, the Indian leak. Now, even if a man survived storms and pirates, disease claimed thousands more. The numbers are really stark. Between 1700 and 1794, of the 8,000 sailors who left the town of Delft, only 5,000 returned. And for the ship's accompanying soldiers, just 600 out of more than 2,000 survived. So what did this mean for Delft? Well, it meant that women's self-sufficiency was not a choice. It was a necessity. And they didn't just keep potteries alive, they grew them. Imagine these Delft potteries these women owned and oversaw. Behind the brick facades, each pottery could produce up to an amazing estimated 200,000 objects a year by the 30 to 60 employees, each with a specialty. Rowers bringing up the pots and vases on their wheels. The givers, they're dipping the fired dishes into the vats of the white glaze. And the stokers feeding the wood. And the painters brushing on cobalt designs. So let's ask, were there any female Delftware painters too? If they could paint on oil, on canvas, why not pottery? The truth is, without the signatures, and Delftware wasn't usually signed by the painter, we don't know yet, but I like to think so. The history of women's stewardship of Delftware doesn't end with the owners of these potteries. There were also the patrons, and Delftware's biggest fan, Queen Mary II, who reigned over England from 1689 to 1694 as co-monarch together with her cousin William III. Now, married off to William of Orange at the age of 15, Mary moved to Holland, where she fell in love not just with her husband's country, but with its ceramics. And when she became queen, she took Delftware back with her to England. And what was her most spectacular project? That would be the water gallery at Hampton Court Palace. Imagine an old riverside boathouse on the Thames, transformed into a jewel box retreat. Mary hired the leading architects, designers, and artists of her age, including Sir Christopher Wren, Daniel Moreau, Grinling Gibbons. Every surface of this maison de plaisir was blue and white. The upholstery, the furnishing, the sconces, even the frames on her paintings. And of course, quantities of Delftware, made just for her by the Greek A pottery, towering, giant blue and white ewers, Delft flower pyramids or tulip vases, standing nearly 5 feet tall for the cascading blooms, not just tulips, but the broad variety of flowers from her magnificent gardens. And the monumental tiles. In a world where the standard Dutch tile is about the size of your hand, these were almost 2 feet across, and they were canvases in earthenware that pushed the boundary of Dutch tile making. She even built a pleasure dairy where her maids served milk and cream in Delft dishes. Now, this is a full century before Marie Antoinette built her dairy at Versailles. Now, no images or plans of the water gallery survived. It was dismantled and the building destroyed by William after Mary's sudden death by smallpox in 1694. She was just 32 years old. But using the written descriptions and inventories and the last pieces that remain, we can still maybe imagine it, right? Did, for example, the pleasure dairy at Hampton Court possibly look like this? Well, we don't know. But we do know that Mary, patron, brought Delftware to new heights, and she turned it into a true royal obsession. And thanks to her rooms across Europe began filling with ceramics, stacked floor to ceiling. Now, after Mary's death, the ceramic world changed fast. Delft potters suddenly faced tough new rivals. In the early 1700s, Meissen in Germany produced the first true European porcelain. It was white, it was translucent, it was strong. By mid-century, the French and France dazzled with Sèvres, all brilliant colors and elegance. And then from England, now there came the real disruptor. That was the cheap coal-fired creamware flooding the markets. Now to survive, Delft had to adapt, and for a while they did. They tweaked their shapes and they kept pace with fashion. So here's an 18th century Delft example that came from the workshop. Yes, also of Gertrude Versailles on the right. A kettle. It's very a la mode, don't you think? And it's unmistakably aware of its competition, the French Sèvres on the left. As European porcelain rose in prominence, Delftware, it endured. It changed shape, it changed styles, but it always maintained that blue and white allure. But by the early 19th century, the tides had changed. Dutch Golden Age ends. The Dutch East India Company, bloated by corruption, crushed by costs, dissolved. 1799. Guild of St. Luke, along the city's artistic backbone, disbanded. 1833. Even the iconic Delft gates immortalized in Vermeer's View of Delft, dismantled, the parts sold for building materials. So by 1835, only 5 of the once more than 30 Delft potteries remained, but declining economy and fierce global competition made survival nearly impossible. By the 1860s, just 1 pottery remained. The porcelain vase, or the porcelain bottle, today known as Royal Delft. And so, in just over 2 centuries, Delft was fading into obscurity. But just when Delft seemed lost to history, blue and white ceramics roared back into fashion. In the 1870s, Britain and America were swept up in what the press gleefully called China mania. And at that point, the word China meant a lot more than just porcelain from Asia. China had become the catch-all term, stretching from European tin-glazed earthenware to the most coveted imports from Asia. And what really mattered wasn't geography. It was about the craze for collecting anything blue and white. And this craze was fueled by the aesthetic movement, a reaction against the mass consumerism of the Industrial Revolution. They were completely disillusioned with these inexpensive, repetitive goods, and a new generation of artists and intellectuals, among them Dante Gabriel Rossetti and my favorite James McNeill Whistler, championed a philosophy of art for art's sake. Beauty, they argued, should permeate our everyday life, and beauty, their eyes, came in the form of blue and white. So fashionable men and women began filling their homes with the Chinese porcelain, the Japanese bowls, the Iznik dishes, the Dutch tiles, and of course what they now called, quote, the old Delft. And for them, those pieces were not necessities, these were declarations, these were objects that signaled taste, they signaled worldliness and refinement. So Whistler too wove this aesthetic throughout his art, featuring blue and white porcelain prominently in his paintings. And in doing so, he helped cement ceramic's place at the very center of fashionable interiors. And so even as Delft's kilns went cold, the world's obsession with blue and white endured, but reignited reinvented and carried forward by this new generation of collectors and dreamers, tastemakers. With Delft's potteries silent, and the appetite for the old blue and white growing really exponentially, a thriving market for, oh yes, you got it, fakes and forgeries quickly emerged. So the unscrupulous dealers could pass off the newly made as counterfeits, as these newly made counterfeits as antiques, or they could add false marks of well-known potteries to the unmarked pieces, right? Instantly inflating value. One of the most prolific imitators was the French firm of Sanson-Ici, Paris. And on the left is an original 18th century Delft plate. On the right, that's actually a Samson painter's watercolor cheat sheet. This is what they would hold up as they painted their copies. And though Samson's marked their piece with an S, couldn't those marks have been scraped away? Blurring the line between copy and original. For collectors, the market became a minefield and sparking a boom in those, yes, best-selling guidebooks to help tell the fakes from the real thing. So many of those guides were written by women. Jenny Young, yes, she's a young New Yorker, published her encyclopedic The Ceramic Arts in 1875. It was a work so popular it received a full-page coverage in the New York Times. Another was the New Yorker Alice Morse Earle, who lived in Brooklyn, and over 14 years she produced 17 bestsellers on subjects ranging from ceramics to colonial history. She also wrote more than 47 magazine articles on everything from furniture to Delftware. Now, these women, along with actually many others, became powerful voices in shaping public taste. And they not only fed the voracious appetite for collecting, they helped train new generations, often women themselves, to become their own ceramic specialists. So meanwhile, across America, women were embarking on their own ceramic chases. Beginning shortly after the Civil War, collecting blue and white ceramics became a national passion. In 1878, William Culver Prime, who is the author of Pottery and Porcelain of All Times and All Nations, he described the meteoric rise of American enthusiasm. He says, quote, 10 years ago, there were probably not 10 collectors of pottery and porcelain in the United States. Today, there are perhaps 10,000. So among these enthusiasts was actually his wife, Mary Trumbull Prime, who traveled through Europe and Africa and Asia to build what was an encyclopedic collection, from Greek kylixes to Dutch Delftware. And I just learned, so they're actually, a lot of it is located at Princeton in their art museum, which is actually opening up next week, reopening. So her collection in 1875, though, she loaned it to the newly founded Metropolitan Museum of Art. But rather than just buying from New York dealers, Mary, like many women of her era, including her sister here, Annie Trumbull Slosson, she also found a more adventurous path, one that demanded time, planning, and stamina. And it was called China hunting. So China hunting began in the United States shortly after the Civil War in the 1860s, and it was centered largely in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, where collectors, if you're ready for this, went directly into households to purchase ceramics. So they cut out the dealers and they stepped into the adventure themselves. China hunters would often arrive by train, then hire carriages to set off across rural landscapes and seaside villages. Now you could picture them rumbling down the dusty lanes, past weathered farmhouses. They're venturing into thick forests, and they're knocking on doors, they're peeking through windows, and they're inquiring about your family heirlooms tucked away on kitchen shelves. So they're armed with these new pocket-sized guides, like this. This is Fanny Bury Palliser's bestseller of 1876. It's called The China Collector's Pocket Companion. A woman could check pottery marks on the spot before making a deal. Now, of course, China hunting could be both lengthy and clearly costly, but its appeal was powerful. It allowed collectors to bypass the dealers, avoid inflated prices, and most importantly, sidestep that growing flood of fakes and forgeries. Now, one 1909 article in the Boston Cooking School magazine advised, quote, "It is cheaper to buy from country homes than from town shops, and one feels more certain that her old blue is genuine." So, yet for many American women, the draw was more than just the authenticity. It was the thrill of the chase. This was an opportunity for adventure. The most common discoveries were actually the bright blue English Staffordshire wares, the mass produced in the 19th century. But on occasion, collectors did discover older treasures, those 17th and 18th century Chinese porcelain, or even on an authentic piece of Dutch delftware itself, often the last surviving pieces and fragments of family collections handed down in these former English and Dutch territories. So here you can see the result, a late 19th century China hunter's trophy room. Now, for these women, China hunting was never just about the objects. It was about discovery, it was about community, and it was about independence. So at the very moment when women across the country were pursuing this old blue, and if truly lucky, finding that piece of old Delft, a very different adventure was taking shape here in New York City. In the 1890s, a group of women were ready to take collecting to the next level. And they would not only gather objects, but they would share them with the world. On March 2nd of 1897, Alice Claypole Vanderbilt, that's Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt II, opened the doors of her chateau-like home at 1 West 57th Street to more than 200 female guests. Now, her daughter, Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, the future founder of the Whitney Museum, was by her side. Now, Alice was no ordinary hostess. A self-made queen of New York society, Alice was a fearless leader who raised the art of opulent living to new heights during the American's Gilded Age. Her mansion, an entire city block just over there, today includes the site of what is now Bergdorf Goodman. And next to it, you can see that's actually the Plaza Hotel to the right. Her home was encircled by a towering wrought iron fence, you can see. And it contained more than 130 rooms, her home. Now imagine it, this Louis XV and Louis XVI style salons. It had a dining room glittering with masterpieces. It had a Moorish smoking room, and it had a gilded ballroom that could hold hundreds. Now it was in that ballroom that Alice and her fellow members of one of New York's newest female organizations gathered. That was the National Society of Colonial Dames in the state of New York. Now that day, the women enjoyed tea, a lecture, and an exhibition of rare silver furniture, and of course, blue and white ceramics. Alice's guest list that day was remarkable. These were women of society, yes, but they were also women who were deeply engaged in shaping New York's cultural life. Many of these women were tied closely to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, including on the right, Mrs. J. Pierpont Morgan. Now, together, these women formed a powerful and often overlooked network. But make no mistake, this gathering was not just social, but these women were plotting something unprecedented. They wanted to found their own museum. Now think about it. Alice Vanderbilt, Mrs. Morgan, and these women, they couldn't vote, and they weren't welcome on museum boards, including the Met. And yet, they founded their own museum, and it would be an institution that they conceived, financed, curated, and run entirely by women. And the women chose a museum site that was steeped in history, the Van Cortlandt Mansion in the Bronx. This land was once the home of the Native American Wet'suwet'en people before it was acquired by the Dutch West India Company in 1639. Soon after, Adrian van der Donck purchased the property. He was, of course, the Leiden-educated lawyer and frequent nemesis of Peter Stuyvesant. He purchased it. And then a century later, in 1748, Jacobus van Cortlandt's descendants built the stone house that still stands today. It was constructed with enslaved labor. In the 18th century, it welcomed guests from George Washington to the future King William IV of England. By the 1890s, however, the house had fallen into disrepair. It had been sold to the city and had been even used by the National Guard as a changing space for the cavalry. And that's when the Dames stepped in. They cleared the brush, they repaired the rooms, including its Dutch tiled fireplaces, and they gathered historic objects, but not just to restore a mansion, but to create a public museum. Now, on May 27th of 1897, before a crowd of over 1,200 that included New York's mayor, the Van Cortlandt House Museum opened its Dutch doors. Now, just days earlier, the Hewitt sisters had inaugurated their Cooper Union Museum for the Arts of Decoration. Today, it's called Cooper Hewitt. Together, these two small museums marked a turning point. These were America's first female-led museums. The New York Times celebrated the opening of the Van Cortlandt House Museum and declared, quote, "Although it is the smallest free museum in the city, it is by far the most interesting." Now, inside this museum were wood and glass display cases, and visitors saw relics like Aaron Burr's pistols, a piece of Martha Washington's wedding dress, and Peter Stuyvesant's snuff box. Yet, the greatest artifact of all was perhaps at the time was the house itself. These women made a deliberate choice. They named the museum not after themselves, but the family of Dutch descent that had built the house centuries earlier. And then they set about to create a collection that would honor that legacy. They gathered American and European fine and decorative arts tied to the home's heritage. Before long, Dutch furniture and Delftware took a prominent role connecting the house to a much larger story of Dutch culture and influence. And the public responded. From opening day, New Yorkers poured in. Some came by train, others came by newly fashionable bicycle. In the summer of 1897, as many as 5,000 visitors would arrive daily. In 1903, the Van Cortlandt House Museum gained a new attraction, the Dutch Garden. Spread across 5 acres, it was anything but modest. Had gravel paths. Oh yes, a system of canals. And parterres radiating from a central fountain, evoking Het Loo in Holland, the Dutch Versailles created by William and Mary. Picture it, each spring, there were more than hundreds of thousands of tulips bloomed. And the design came from the architect Samuel Parsons Jr., but it was the persistence of women, including Mrs. J. Pierpont Morgan, the author Alice Morse Earle, and one of the most influential garden writers of the early 20th century, a founding member of the Garden Club of America. Her name was Helena Rutherford Ely. They brought this garden to life. And for them, the garden was as much cultural as botanical. It was a tribute to New York's Dutch roots. Now, at the same time, America was swept up in Holland mania And from the 1880s to the 1920s, Dutch influence showed up literally everywhere, from new brands, including Dutch boy paints, to Dutch colonial revival architecture. Even Vermeer suddenly became the favorite of Gilded Age painting collectors. Now, New York was especially caught up during the Hudson Fulton celebration. 1909, more than 300,000 visitors flocked to the Van Cortlandt House Museum that summer. And behind it was a search for identity. At a time of mass immigration, some Americans looked to the Netherlands, even calling it, as the popular Ladies' Home Journal put it, the Netherlands is actually the mother of America. Now, by the 1920s, New York's Gilded Age was vanishing, and Alice Vanderbilt's Fifth Avenue Palace, the frequent meeting place for these dames, was razed in 1927. The dames observed, quote, "We have grown so large that we can no longer meet in our members' drawing rooms. The drawing rooms themselves are disappearing." So they built a headquarters. It was designed by the architect Richard Henry Dana Jr., and the cornerstone was laid in 1930. And they continued their work on this Van Cortlandt House Museum, and by the 1940s, it was home to a nationally recognized decorative art collection. By 1965, it had grown to include more than 75 pieces of Dutch Delftware, so many that it demanded its own gallery of its own, and what was an 18th century dining room was transformed and proudly renamed the Exhibition Room. Now, since the house had opened its Dutch door to the public in 1897, more than now 1 million visitors had come to see it and had walked through. Now, for many, it was their very first encounter with Dutch Delftware, and for others, for devoted ceramic lovers, the Van Cortlandt House Museum had become a destination. Even Dr. David Rohl, who was the former director of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, came to see it. So can you just imagine? You step into this exhibition room, what would you have seen? Few photographs survive, but records tell us the displays filled at least 7 bronze-mounted glass cabinets. The range of Delft was dazzling, from 17th century Chinese or rack-style pieces to the 18th century Rococo-inspired forms. There was Delft really in every form imaginable. There were the familiar objects, the plates, the bowls, the lidded vases, the teapots, and then there were unfamiliar ones, pieces made for customs long since vanished. There were pipe stands created to cradle those long stemmed Dutch clay pipes. Barber bowls that were with the scalloped rim cut away to fit snug against a gentleman's neck. Some pieces were functional. There were the butter tubs, the salt cellars, and others were purely sculptural, whimsical, or symbolic. One cabinet held a laughing Buddha, the Buddha Hashang, with a plump belly and a wide brim, but as you can see in this Dutch version, he's holding his clay pipes and his cup of tea. Another case featured the figure of a Dutch woman. Now she has the hat and petticoat, her hands are firmly planted on her hips, a tiny sculpture, but with remarkable authority, wouldn't you agree? Now, many works bore the marks of Delft's finest potters. From the White Star came a butter tub depicting a boy with his pet yellow bird. From the Greek A, under the leadership of the widow Johanna van der Hoel, this beautiful Mari style dish. Unsigned pieces too revealed exquisite craftsmanship. This is a pair of gilt Famille Rose Delftware bird cages made around remarkably 1730. These delicate cages reflected the Dutch Republic's global reach. Alongside spices and silks and porcelain, the Dutch East India Company carried many exotic birds, back from Asia. These were the parakeets, the parrots. These were the prize pets of both princes and merchants alike. Now, these Delftware bird cages are rectangular and they have working doors. They have little food drawers that you can pull in and out. And you can see the little metal bars. But could they have really ever held real birds? Probably, certainly not. These were demonstrations really of pure ceramic virtuosity. These push the limits of what earthenware clay should be able to do. The exhibition room was not just about form, it was about color. Kaleidoscope, shades, hues, not just blue and white. So now this collection was clearly not the Rijksmuseum, nor did it glitter with incredible royal provenance, but it carried something else. The history built over decades. It was shaped by the commitment and the collaboration of a group of women. Women who preserved and curated it and gave Delftware a home in the Bronx. They ensured that it would not be lost, instead remained living witness to our history. So then in the 1960s, the women of the Van Cortlandt House Museum found themselves at a crossroads. On one hand, New York was celebrating. The Lincoln Center was going up, and the World's Fair was dazzling visitors in Queens. But underneath that energy, New York was facing real financial trouble. Funding for the parks and cultural institutions was shrinking rapidly, and the Van Cortlandt Park felt it. The museum, which sits right in the center, in the heart of the park, was left exposed, and the Delftware collection was suddenly felt vulnerable. And in 1965, the women had to make a very difficult call. They decided to move these pieces, not because they wanted to, but because they felt it was the only way to make sure these fragile treasures would survive. The Delftware's destination, well, just 5 blocks from where we are here today, on East 71st Street, the Colonial Danes headquarters, and through a black Dutch door, up a grand staircase, into a bright upper room, the Delftware emerged again, high above the Manhattan streets, but ready for its next chapter. So this afternoon, you've met just a few of the women whose lives are bound to Delftware, pottery owners, patrons, collectors, writers, historians, and museum founders. They may have been called the weaker vessel in their time, but in truth, they were really anything but. They were ambitious, they were resilient, they were resourceful. So the next time that you spot a piece of Delftware, I really hope that whether it's in a museum case or better yet, I hope you can come up to the Van Cortlandt House Museum in the Bronx, or come to the headquarters of the Colonial Danes, which is always always open. That you see it maybe this time a little differently. I hope that you see Delft not just as a beautiful art that it is, but also a vessel for women's stories, a tangible link to centuries of hidden ingenuity and ambition. So a single shard of pottery or even small puzzle jug can open an entire world if we choose to look beyond blue and white. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. You want to take a seat?
Sure.
And then we can take some questions. Okay. Yes. That's okay. They're on, but I don't think they're. I think it's. Okay, so thanks you for joining us. So happy to be here. What was your most surprising story that you've done? was you were researching these amazing women?
Oh my gosh, I think it was just the sheer number of the pottery owners that were women. Because I hadn't realized, I started with that one maker, but then when you're looking and you realize that it was there, would have been such a female-led area, sure. When, a lot of my research, I spent a lot of time in Delft itself, and I went back to what's the, to the pottery, where the potteries were located along the canals. And there was this one point where I stood at a corner and I realized that this one female pottery owner, if she could look out at the neighboring, because as I'm sure many people here have developed as well, you realize that the potteries were all in one section of the town. If she looked out her window in this one specific year in 1707, she looked out of the potteries all around them, it was like 4 out of 5 were all run by women at the same time. So it would have been a really, it was a powerful time for women.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you think nowadays, I feel people think of the decorative arts as primarily female, but we don't really think about that in the past. You know, we don't think that women did have such a big role in this. Like traditionally, we think it was left to the men, but really some of the most beautiful pieces were created by women, whether they were painted by women, which I also believe.
Yeah, it'll come out, it will.
I believe
I'm confident.
If you can, there are Greek pots that are very identifiable by this one specific painter, even though we don't know who he or she was. I feel like if people spend more time looking at Delft iconography, we could potentially identify like these 20 pots were painted by the same person. I do think that the more delicate touch was the female touch in the painting of these pots as well as the shape.
I think, yeah, and just the amount of reach, I mean, what I was also so impressed was just the level of the archival abilities in the Netherlands. It's unparalleled, like their work and the amount of information that they are gathering, as we speak, and the research that's being done there. So I'm just confident that it's a matter of, like within the next decade.
Yeah.
They'll be revealing more and more and more. Just the correspondence, I think they're finding a lot from just the everyday details of life that reveal, people's roles. But it's, the archive of Delft itself is fast.
Yeah, it's amazing how much the Dutch really did just write down, like the Holland Society funded the translation of all of these records from.
Yes, that's right, yeah, thanks, yeah.
It is, yes, that inspired Russell Shorto's book, Island of the Center of the World.
Amazing, yeah.
And a lot of those records were lost in a fire in Albany in the 1900s.
The famous fire,
Yes.
oh my God, yes.
But still, there's so much there, and you can trace the ownership of the building or of a piece of furniture. It's amazing how much was there. So I do think that once the material is just read, we will find out more.
It's so exciting, I can't wait.
Yeah, me too. Are there any questions that people would like to ask? Yes, I bet you.
In terms of today, like I have some pieces that say Delft and I got them in 1961 in the Netherlands. I mean, those, is there any value, not value, I mean, but is there any really artistically merit going on today?
Of course, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're fantastic. I think right now there's actually at Markham, there is a fantastic group. So when you go to the Rijksmuseum, for example, you'll see that they work with the pottery at Markham because they're doing the finest work in actual tin glazed earthenware now. Not in Delft, but in Markham. So when the Rijksmuseum needs restoration and also additional pieces, or I think when they purchased a gorgeous pair of the flower pyramids, and there were parts that were missing, this one group there works at such a high level. And they truly are works of art. And then there are a lot of, I so enjoy, meeting and working with the curators of the Kunstmuseum in The Hague. And, they're actually commissioning, contemporary, ceramic artists to create, works. So I think that the traditions are alive and well, and they're just taking their own organic path, into different forms of art. But I think, what was really interesting, I did, really, when the book first came out, I had a wonderful interview with, Robin Young of NPR, and she was inspired because she grew up with Delftware that was made in the 1960s. And it had like just profound meaning to her as well, is that connection with those pieces and her family history, which inspired her to do the interview, because she felt so strongly. So I think they're all, I mean, Delftware itself from its inception was made at all levels, from the everyday to the extraordinary for Queen Mary. And they all have an equal importance, in sort of the history of the work. And I think that's frankly why the world continues to be in love with Dutch Delftware. It's because it touches at every level, in its creation.
But my grandson's cat broke one of the pieces.
Oh, but actually, sorry, so, and then I've been contacted also as a little book to, with contemporary artists, and one artist, actually, his, name's Robert Strati. He's a contemporary artist whose wife had inherited a piece of blue and white and dropped it. And with the fragments, he created a work of art. And that work of art, then he has a whole series of contemporary work that's all based on the idea of fragmented blue and white, Delftware, blue and white transferware. But it's, that, I think it all, it's fascinating.
You mentioned the women painters. There's a wonderful exhibit in Washington at the National Museum of Women in the Arts of Dutch women painters of the 16th, 17th, and 18th century. But it's there to, it's there till I think around the end of the year.
Okay, I'll definitely go. I'll be down there shortly, so I'll make sure I go. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes.
You mentioned this was fascinating. I love learning hidden history since it's such a fascinating hidden history. I was wondering, in terms of kind of the level of interest in it historically, you mentioned the spectrum of everyday use to fine art from Queen Mary. Is there a point at which it really turned and became this, kind of looking at it from a perspective of this should be in a museum, we should collect it? And was there the fact that it's Queen Mary that commissioned these pieces, the fact that it's the women of the Gilded Age, was there any kind of fact that it was a lot of women doing this that made it more difficult to get into maybe the idea of fine art, or has it always been this idea of?
So it's an interesting question, and it's a layered question because it's interesting because the flip side, actually, in the early 19th century, who was collecting and who was starting to put Delftware into this sort of historic context that we find, it was actually men. So you had actually the museum at Sèvres which has an encyclopedic collection of its own. Their executive director, if you can imagine this, it's like 1810. I mean, it's just like within, like not far after, like the end of, the end of the whole thing, the Dutch Republic. They start sourcing pieces and trying to locate pieces for their collection because they want to capture it, as in the history of ceramics. And then you have a number of male collectors in both Belgium and in the Netherlands that are then voraciously collecting. And so it's actually a French art historian who then writes the first book on the history of Dutch Delftware, Henri Avar. And what's also interesting and really tied to the aesthetic movement is that it was also seen as sort of revolutionary for artists to say, as Whistler did, that decorative arts are actually an art form. And that was a kind of a revolutionary statement. That was kind of counter academy. Is to say, you know, our compatriots, you know, the decorative art furniture makers, they are artists as well. So this was kind of like a 19th century, so the women were then stepping into the dialogue. So, but they weren't necessarily, they were a part of the dialogue, but it was, yeah, it's an interesting question because it talks a lot, it touches on, you know, identity and collecting, which is, that's a whole topic itself.
No, it's fascinating because the idea of women going out and writing these guidebooks for China hunting, and whether that gets seen then as it's a women's activity versus the fact that in the 19th century there were, you know, it started with the men or the men were very much part of it. Yeah, it's fascinating.
Right, it's no, so true, I agree with you, like, what does it, did it have more of an open door? Was it, you know, or probably, I mean, you know, and also the whole subject of historians, you know, female historians, this was very, academic, you know, the women really weren't a part of the role of, in the 19th century with the rise of, you know, a lot of the, well, I'm gonna say, like, a lot of the, you know, the writing about the Dutch Republic, the academic, was all, like, women weren't a part of the whole, just the writing of history at that time. So were the decorative arts a way of entering that subject as well? You know, are these the side doors into, it's like someone like Alice Morse Earl able to, like, step in through that door? So it's, I love the 19th century. I think it's fascinating.
You and I were speaking earlier about Stanford White Summer Home Boxtail, which has a big, the former kitchen that's covered with Delft tiles. And interestingly, Stanford White is credited with every single aspect of this house, but his wife was the one who was going out and finding the Delft tiles and really collected that. So that's another bit where women's contribution has been sidelined, shall we say.
Yeah, and my understanding is a number of his residential commissions feature blue and white tiles in their fireplaces. Yeah, that gives, it's fascinating. I want to learn more about her, because she is a great character. Someone needs to write a book about her.
Absolutely. Yes.
This idea of hunting for ceramics in people's homes, just going out, knocking on doors.
You gotta make it up.
I had heard about it from, with salt glazed pottery. I know people who actually used to do it, who are very elderly now, but that's how they amassed a collection of saltware. And just hearing that it was also this Delft hunt makes me wonder, you know, it's sort of like the reverse of Antiques Roadshow.
And that's a great point, right? Is that we've always created this, you know, we've created this connection, right?
But that people could go to somebody's house and be peeking in their windows, and that's acceptable behavior.
Right, taking their family heirlooms, you know,
Yeah.
for a song.
And then could you pull out your dishes and see if there's anything I'd like from your collection? It's a riot.
Yeah, it seems inconceivable. And what was fantastic was that, you know, that these female writers wrote, it was really fun. So when you read the China Hunters, she writes it from the perspective of a young female member of this group going out. And so it's very first person. So you can kind of step into the role with her. I don't know of a lot of other collecting books where we have this incredible treasure trove where you can actually, you know, be with them on their carriages.
What it felt like to them, and
Yeah, But my understanding is that the women, the homeowners themselves were also pretty wily themselves. So they would play these roles like, oh, that was, never thought about it. You perfectly well what it was,
Right.
and, you know, and so it was a dance. It was a dance where the people who owned the ceramics knew perfectly well how much they wanted it, and they would let these, you know, these city slickers, you know, think that they were, you know, yeah, but it was actually, you know, they would turn the tables on them, so it's just a great story.
Yeah, so much must have been, I mean, I understood the salt jugs were all on the porches, so people would be driving around, they'd see one as they go. Yeah, right, stop and knock on the door and hopefully go home with somebody else's pottery, I mean, porch pottery. Yeah.
There's a great, oh, sorry, yes.
No, it just seems like, I wonder what else they were looking for, all kinds of things, I mean, Christie's must document a lot of that.
Well, there's this one story I included in the book, which is about, well, Alice Morse Earl herself was also a shine hunter. And so apparently she was trying she saw some delftware through a window, and apparently she went up on the top of a hen house to get a closer look. And she fell through the roof.
Oh my
And
gosh.
she was stuck. She couldn't get out. So she had to wait until the owner came home. And the owner graciously like pulled her out, and but she wrote the entire article. I'm gonna say and it's not fiction. I think it's truly an account of her. And so she says, you know, if you think that China hunting is boring, let me tell you, this is not your average. Anyway, it's hysterical.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Forgive me, I know right behind you.
No, that's delightful. So I know more about porcelain from China, but there's a distinctly different quality about sort of searching and collecting dough. It has almost more of a domestic kind of quality. How would you contrast those? Was it just the distance and the age of Chinese porcelain that made it like a different kind of category?
Oh, you mean just in terms of
Yes.
collecting of like who it appealed to?
Yeah.
So interesting. I feel, you know, depending on the period, like in the 19th century or in the early 20th, I think that it was, I think again, like with the Holland mania, and I think that has such a huge impact that it was so, I think Americans, and I speak to this more as an American,
You think
and
it sort of resonated?
Yeah, that there was just this incredible interest in, well, because of our mass immigration, we were really looking at, you know, our own culture. And so I think, the Chinese porcelain is, and the, you know, export, amazing. But I think that it was, that the Dutch pieces they may have been even more rare, I think, at a certain point, in terms of what they made, you know, by the 19th century. But it's a great question. Yeah, I was just doing some reading this week about, right, the market for, you know, what did it look like when the Dutch were selling the delftware. They were, you know, shipping it here in the 17th and 18th century, and where did it go? And you know, what the channels, because it was tangent, but it's fascinating that this delftware, because you find delftware shirts from Florida to Maine. I mean, it's like this amazing, you know, that the Dutch West India Company really, there was a quantity here, at one point. And I'd love to learn more about that. Mine was more centered primarily on the European aspect, but now that I finished the book, I'd love to learn more about, you know, where it went, you know, and how it was integrated within these collections. So it's interesting, I'm going to be speaking at Drayton Hall down in South Carolina, and they've discovered, their archaeologists discovered black delftware at Drayton, which is incredibly rare, so there's, I guess, a whole fascinating
Yeah.
subject.
To see just what's left behind.
Yeah, what's left of it,
Any last questions, Jim?
Yes, in addition to cobalt, manganese was another material used for
Love manganese,
interesting colors.
yes.
Was there a difference in terms of the level of popularity of it in earlier times, and how is that different today?
The manganese, I love the manganese, and who also loved manganese was Queen Mary as well. Have you been to Aunt Lou? Oh my goodness, so when you go to Aunt Lou, she has, and I talk about it in the book, she has a beautiful, she had a personal apartment built in the very, like the garden level. And it included an area for jam making, which I loved. And her jam making area is all manganese and blue. So if the queen, or she was princess at the time when she built, but the princess is, designing manganese as well as blue, it's special. So, I think it's not as common really as the blue, but it's gorgeous, so.
It's interesting to look at Marie Antoinette and then Queen Mary and see the playing at being a normal person. And I think that going back to the question of the difference between porcelain from China and Delftware being a more accessible piece, that was chosen instead of Chinese porcelain.
Well, she clearly also, it was so closely tied to identity as, in her own lance. So I think it was also a choice to show power and the power of the Dutch industry itself. But I think it was also, I think that like the choice of using Delftware for someone like Mary is so interesting because she was able to, have such a personal, make such personal choices, as opposed to the Chinese porcelain that was literally, coming off the ships. But this she could design herself.
And
So.
commission and really just add like this, as you say, a personal interest in it, instead of just picking out from what is
But
already.
she loved Chinese porcelain.
Right.
But this was something unique.
Something custom compared to off the rent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So could haute couture.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you.
So Genevieve will be signing books in the back, and there's coffee, tea, soft drinks, and snacks.
Thanks. Thanks.